Israel, well, at least its Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu seems to have no interest whatsoever in ending the Gaza war through Hamas's proposal. Then when will a breakthrough come? For more, we're joined by Professor Austin Knuppe this morning. Welcome back.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Thanks for joining us. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has rejected Hamas's proposal to end the war in exchange for freeing the remaining hostages. Does Netanyahu want to see the end of Hamas? Is that what Israel really wants?
Well, the interests of the Netanyahu coalition and that of the Israeli people, I think, are quite divergent. Netanyahu is beginning to understand that the two goals of IDF operations in Gaza, eliminating and degrading Hamas and freeing the hostages, are mutually exclusive. The Israeli approach to defeating Hamas is not going to lead to the release of the hostages, and Netanyahu is incapable of waging the war in such a manner that will also release the hostages. And so he's in a no-win situation, both politically within his coalition and also among the Israeli people.
Definitely calls for a deal are growing within Israel, like you mentioned, especially from families of those hostages vowing to continue their protest. Some say Netanyahu will have to give in eventually. Professor, what's your take on this?
So Netanyahu, in the last week especially, has faced increased domestic opposition to the coalition war plan in Gaza. We've seen public protests in the Knesset and out on the streets, that the Israeli people are increasingly growing war-weary and upset that the remaining 130 hostages have not been released. At the same time, Netanyahu is keeping an eye on the American election, understanding that his viability as prime minister and his ability to maintain a coalition is also dependent on who wins the White House in November 2024. And so it's a delicate balancing game of managing politics within his own coalition within Tel Aviv and also managing or watching and monitoring the U.S. election this autumn.
Right. The Israeli PM is surely under huge pressure within his country, but the U.S. is also pushing Israel and Hamas to really accept a comprehensive plan that would end the war, release those hostages, and form a Palestinian state, which Netanyahu has strongly rejected. Do you think there needs to be more pressure from Washington? What do you think?
It's certainly. The recent negotiations to introduce a ceasefire by the 5 Arab states are notable and honorable. The problem is you need the Americans on board for that negotiation, that the Biden administration needs to exercise leverage and conditionality with security assistance and support to Netanyahu and to the Israeli Defense Force. The only way this will be resolved, particularly on the end of protecting Palestinian civilians and releasing the hostages, is for the Biden administration to offer conditional assistance based on resumption of a two-state solution peace plan. There needs to be a political settlement. There's no military solution to what's going on in Gaza. There's a political negotiation alongside military campaign.
Right. Professor Knuppe, then if the conflict over in Gaza does last as Netanyahu insists and wishes, how long do you think it'll actually last? I mean, how well will Israel and Hamas be able to actually hold up?
The answer to that depends not only on battlefield conditions within South Gaza, it's also what happens on the Israeli street. If the domestic public within Israel are growing increasingly frustrated with the lack of progress, particularly the lack of hostage release, you'll see mounting domestic pressure that will affect Netanyahu's domestic political calculus and also the way they wage the campaign in Gaza. Right now, we've seen attacks just in the last 48 hours, killing 65, increasing humanitarian pressure on the residents of Khan Yunis in South Gaza. And as the humanitarian situation gets more dire, international pressure, particularly from the Europeans and the Americans, is only bound to increase. And so Netanyahu is facing domestic pressure at home from the Israeli electorate alongside pressure from international partners.
Definitely. Netanyahu's ultimate goal is to destroy Hamas. And how realizable is that goal to actually see the end of Hamas?
Well, I think we've seen the answer to that since 2005, that the ability of the Israeli military to grade and destroy Hamas as a militant organization is extraordinarily difficult. Even if you're able to eliminate the current political and military leadership of the organization, the ideology is still going to exist. And the problem is the way the IDF has waged the war in Gaza has increased Palestinian support for Hamas since the war began. We've seen through waves of surveying that prior to the war, 1 in 4 residents of Gaza supported Hamas, and now it's up to 1 in 3, or perhaps as high as 40% of Palestinians see Hamas as the only force viable resistance force to force the Israeli government to the negotiating table.
Definitely, it's a lot more complicated than it looks based on the past experience that the Israel and Hamas saw. All right, Professor Knuppe, thank you so much for your time this morning. We appreciate it, as always.
Thanks for having me. Take care.